This is nothing I've ever heard of. I came across this by chance, just scrolling through the BBC iPlayer. They sort of sometimes have like these out there films that are a little bit unusual, and this is one of those. It's an international film. It wasn't made by any one country, and was a collaboration between a number of nations, and it is about the Bosnian conflict. And Quo Vadis Aida basically is a quote. Basically, it means in the classic, whither thou goest, or modern translations like where are you going? So where are you going, Ada? And Ada is a UN translator who basically volunteers for the UN to translate from Dutch. She works with the Dutch United Nations forces, translating into Serbia, into Serbian. It's set in the Serbian region of the whole Bosnian conflict. And she is an ethnic Muslim, but she is born in Serbia, but her history is Muslim. And as anyone who can remember back to the Bosnian conflict, because in recent years, I think it's almost like slipped from our memories a little bit, because when I saw the sort of the banner for it, I was like, oh yeah, we don't really talk about the Bosnian conflict, because before the events in the Ukraine, people always said, there's sort of been peace in Europe since the Second World War. And then they say, yeah, but there was that thing in the Balkans.
Yeah.
Yeah, apart from that thing. And then it's easy for us to sort of look away from that, thinking, actually, that was quite a serious matter at the time. But for those who remember it or don't, the situation in the Balkans fell apart, where basically neighbours sort of slaughtered each other. And they sort of fell apart along ethnic lines. They were like sort of the Bosnians and Serbs and the sort of people who were sort of Christian Catholics, and then sort of like Muslims. And they had lived side by side in coexistence for years and years and years. And then this conflict basically blew up. And there were the most appalling massacres on both sides, against both sides. So for those of us who are watching it from afar, it's one of those conflicts where you want to say, who are the baddies here? Because it was really hard, from my memory, to work out who you need to be supporting, or who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, because they both did these appalling acts of violence against one another. And
I was just going to say, my dad was posted to Sarajevo in '96. So as part of the sort of situation.
Yeah. So this film is set in 1995, so just before, and basically the UN had been sent in there trying to sort this out, and they had created safe zones where people who were, Muslim could go and live safely, and they were told that you'd be protected by the UN forces. But the drawback of that was these UN forces were tiny, and they were fighting, or they were sort of trying to protect thousands of people with dozens of sort of peacetime soldiers. So a lot of these they weren't like, this is like before Afghanistan, this was before Iraq. So a lot of these men and women who were out there as UN peacekeepers were not combat trained. They were literally had been trained in their services, but they weren't the experienced people now, because our armed forces now, they've been in conflicts for the last 30 years. So they've got that experience behind them. So this was a completely different ballgame for them. And so basically the town of Srebrenica was part of a UN safe zone, and Ada is acting as a translator for the Dutch United Nations forces. And she lives with her husband and her 2 sons. And she's been there, and they've been given an ultimatum that they all have to leave the town, because the forces are coming in and they're going to take it over, and everyone in Srebrenica has to leave. And so literally thousands upon thousands of people flee, and they head to the nearest UN base because they're told the UN are going to protect you. And then you suddenly get this situation where you've got 20,000 people camped in and around this United Nations base. And then I believe it's the Serbs who come along, and their general who says, I want all the men to be evacuated first, and then the women and children become later. But we want the men to be evacuated, and then to make sure that they're not armed, we're going to check them, and we're going to search them, and we're going to put them on buses, and we're just going to ship them out. And the film basically is the 24 hours before this evacuation, where Ada tries to protect her son and husband and her two sons by trying to get them recognized as being UN staff, like she is, because she has protection of the UN, but they're not. So it is basically this story of this family in the unfolding situation at Srebrenica in 1995. And those of you who know your history know what happened, and it is shown quite graphically what happened. But you see, it's almost like a Shakespearean play in like Romeo and Juliet, in which you know what happens at the beginning, but you still hope that what you know is going to happen won't happen.
Yeah, I had a feeling. I had, if you want to start saying what the film was about. So, what did you think?
Well, it was quite intense. It was good in that it reminded me. It was quite a recent film. It's made quite recently. I think it's coming up to the 25th anniversary of the. It's not a spoiler. The Srebrenica massacre, and so it's coming up to the anniversary. And this was made, I think, 2 years ago, where people were saying, we shouldn't be forgetting these events that happened on our doorstep.
Yeah.
And that they're how these events happen, and how that we have to sort of go on afterwards. And so I found it was quite powerful, very moving, very simply shot. I mean, it's not a huge cast, sort of talking parts. You probably only had sort of like a dozen talking parts, but yeah, really moving, really, really, really impactful. And it made me think about that conflict, and I probably haven't given it a thought for years, even though I knew someone who was an ex-Scottie who had been in the British UN forces out there, and sort of had a bit of a hideous ordeal when he was there. But I thought it was impactful. I thought it was powerful bit of filmmaking, and it didn't tell you what to think, but it let the story unfold. So yeah, good. Yeah, I thought it does. It was powerful, good. You couldn't say it was entertaining, because that film doesn't entertain, but it had impact. It had impact, which I like sometimes. So I would give it a 4.
Yeah, it sounds like it falls into this. I saw a list on YouTube where they said, like, here are 10 films that you'll only ever watch once, and it sounds like it would fall into that sort of category. Because the thing is that I actually think about this conflict quite a bit, because I'm a tennis fan, and the world number one is Novak Djokovic, who is Serbian, who is from that area. And a lot of times there's this really divisive thing that happens, especially on Twitter, about people who think he's the best thing ever and the sun shines out of his bum, and people who can't stand him because they say, his on-court demeanor and his everything like that. And the thing that always gets me is that people seem to forget that he grew up in a war zone. and because I always think that obviously he grew up there. He talks about how he had to play his tennis in a swimming pool because all the tennis courts were like bombed and stuff like that. So it's something that does occur to me quite often.